Good morning. My name is Hirss, and I'm from the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. Today here we have Damon Wilson from the Atlantic Council. And well, nice to have you here in Riga, Latvia.
Martin, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with you, but particularly to be here in Riga with LATO. This organization has done so much good for promoting transatlantic relations that I'm just delighted to have the chance to spend the morning with you.
Oh, thank you. The first question will be about the upcoming presidential elections. So we have Republican candidate Mitt Romney and the President Barack Obama. Where do they stand on foreign policy?
You know, it's an unfortunate fact that foreign policy hasn't been at the forefront of this campaign. This campaign, like many in any country, is focused more about the economy, more about jobs, unemployment, tax policy, fiscal policy. But there are some differences on foreign policy, and we've seen in the later stages of the campaign, particularly with the attack on our consulate in Benghazi, with the death of Ambassador Stevens in Libya, foreign policy has injected itself back into the campaign as we get closer to Election Day. What you've seen essentially is a candidate Romney, a Governor Romney, argue that he would have a more forceful presence for the United States in the world, that he has tried to draw some distinctions from President Obama, putting an emphasis, as he's argued, put an emphasis on working with allies rather than attention on adversaries, as Governor Romney has put it. When it comes down to it, there aren't a lot of details out there that show them different. Governor Romney just delivered a major foreign policy speech in the past couple of weeks where he tried to say in many places that not a fundamental difference from the president, but that he'd do more or he'd be stronger. So as you see the issue play out on Iran, this is probably the #1 issue in the United States, how to think about the future of Iran. So Romney didn't argue for a war with Iran, but he did say he tried to do sanctions better. He tried to draw a firmer line in the sand to say that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable and that he would do more to prevent it. But it's not exactly clear to the American people how that differs from President Obama and how President Romney would achieve that in a way that's different. But I think you've seen him speak out a little bit more forcefully on Iran, a little bit more forcefully on China and the role it's played, particularly in currency manipulation, a little bit more on Russia as well, where you heard Governor Romney earlier this year single out Russia as the most important foe, perhaps, of the United States in his own words. But fundamentally, you haven't seen a strong debate on foreign policy that brings out the differences. I do think that this is a very significant election for the United States in terms of foreign policy. I think the next president of the United States will have a lot to do with defining the role that the United States plays in the world, and will have a lot to do with whether the United States sees itself as helping to shape and lead the world, or whether we step back a little bit from the brink in terms of our leadership. And what happens at home in the United States is very much tied to the role we can play internationally. The question facing whether it's President Obama or President Romney will be, first and foremost, are they able to work with Congress to get our act in order at home? We're facing a pretty significant fiscal crisis, a pretty significant crisis that's challenging our political system. We've seen here in Latvia that you've been able to face really difficult circumstances, come together and take tough decisions. The United States political system has not succeeded in doing that over the past 2 years. The next president, if they're able to do that, if they're able to reach a major agreement with Congress about where to go on our budget, our debt, our deficit, our tax policy, I think that will position the president then to be a forceful voice in the world and position the United States to have a strong presence in global affairs. If we fail to do that, it's going to remove some of our moral authority, some of our ability to help lead and shape that world. So in many respects, I think this election, even though there's not a robust debate on foreign policy, I think this next election is going to help define the role that the United States will play in the world. And this will be the first president that has the responsibility to help lead the West at a time when, in the next 4 years, the gross domestic product of Europe and the United States will dip below 50% of the world global output for the first time. significant changes taking place. We'll see if the candidates can rise to the challenge.
Thank you. You touched upon the Middle East just briefly, but I'd like to ask you a question about Afghanistan. Well, earlier this month, Latvian government extended the stay of our troops in Afghanistan for additional year. And in the recent vice presidential debate, Paul Ryan, he said that, well, the end date of withdrawal 2014 is debatable. So what's your perspective? Well, is the withdrawal at 2014 too early, or what's going to happen after the election?
So we're clearly on the path to a drawdown in Afghanistan towards 2014. And frankly, neither President Obama nor Governor Romney have really wanted to put Afghanistan front and center in this campaign. Governor Romney has not drawn out a strong distinction on Afghan policy. And so in many respects, I think regardless of the election outcome, you're going to continue to see the United States support the path that the alliance is already on drawing down forces, perhaps more rapidly than originally planned, so that we do draw down in 2014. Not to mean that we will leave Afghanistan, won't have continued presence. I think that's actually one of the critical issues. If you look at Iraq today, there's very little American influence and presence in Iraq today because we failed to reach agreement with Baghdad on a continued engagement. We don't really have a presence there, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think we're going to be facing real challenges in the Middle East because of an American vacuum in Baghdad, in Iraq. I hope that our leaders draw the right lessons in Afghanistan and realize that even as we draw down, we have to work with our NATO allies to figure out what's a viable, sustainable presence in Afghanistan that doesn't just leave this to a vacuum, doesn't just leave this to a mess, because it will be a mess if we just pick up and walk away. And the next president's going to have to figure that out, and they're going to have to be able to define a process, negotiate an agreement with the Afghan authorities, and convince the American people that this is the right path to take. One of the things that I would just point out, you mentioned the Latvian government's decision to continue its presence in Afghanistan. As an American watching Latvia go through an enormous fiscal crisis, an enormous crisis here where you saw tremendous cuts in revenue, as an American watching Latvian politicians take decisions during this difficult time, it meant a lot to me, it meant a lot to folks in Washington to see Latvia be able to say, despite the cuts we're going through, we're going to protect our commitment in Afghanistan, we're going to ring fence our contribution to Afghanistan and remain a reliable ally in contributing to the cause in Afghanistan. That didn't go without notice, something that I am very proud of Latvia for doing. And now I think the United States has the responsibility to figure out, after our election, how to help lead the alliance in a way that isn't just walking away from this mess. We've invested too much treasure, too much blood, sweat, and tears in Afghanistan to be able to say that we're done. So I think you'll see an interest, and you're hearing this more among people in the Romney camp, that they recognize this, they know there needs to be a continued presence and engagement and sustainment. The president's been less specific on it beyond what has been committed in the NATO framework, and I'm hopeful that either candidate will be able to lay out a strategy of continued American engagement in Central Asia so that we don't make the historic mistake of the past and leave a vacuum there.
Well, but so far, the general feel about Afghanistan, there are reports from that Afghanistan army is attacking all our NATO forces. There are, various generals spoken about, the issues in Afghanistan. Isn't the withdrawal happening too fast?
I think I'm concerned that the withdrawal can happen too fast. Look, it's a tough thing. Afghanistan's a tough place with these attacks from Afghan forces on NATO forces. Of course it's difficult for politicians to defend that deployment. But we were on a huge risk if we draw down too quickly and if we pull our assets out too quickly. To walk away from this after spending more than a decade in Afghanistan and to hand this country back to the Taliban, we've just seen with the incident, the assassination attempt of Malala, these young women, these young girls in Pakistan, what this Taliban represents. It's antithetical to our values, to our morals, and I would hope that our presence in Afghanistan isn't something that we just pack up, walk away, and hand this country back to that. Does it mean that we need to think about how to integrate former Taliban into Afghan society? Of course it does. The Afghans need to take the lead in that process. But I'm concerned that we're going to be looking on how to get out too quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to ask you a question about Russia too. We've seen a different Russia after last elections. And will we see a different United States after this election in November? Because, well, Mitt Romney has outspoken, well, Russia is the geopolitical enemy #1. And will Barack Obama leave the change of Russia unnoticed?
So we're dealing with a difficult, truculent Russia, and no one should be naive about it. And I don't think people in the United States are naive. We know who Vladimir Putin is. We have a track record of dealing with this leader. It's not pleasant. There's a strategy underway. We're watching the screws come down on countries like Moldova. We have to be very careful about how Ukraine plays out, Georgia, Central Asia. This is a Vladimir Putin who's returned to the Kremlin with a very clear policy on trying to reestablish essentially the instruments of the former Soviet Union through the Eurasian Union, through CSTO, through the Eurasian Economic Space. All of these efforts are meant to help exert a real privileged sphere of interest in the region. And that's something that I find unacceptable. So it may have been an exaggeration. In fact, it was an exaggeration for Governor Romney to call Russia the #1 geopolitical foe of the United States. But the underlying point is that we have to figure out how to get this relationship right, and we can't be naive about it. You will see a President Obama who understands who he's dealing with. He's not naive, but is interested in trying to figure out how to move forward with Russia on another round of strategic nuclear reductions. You'll see a real effort in a second Obama term, if the president's reelected, to strike out on a new agreement on strategic reductions. But the Russians aren't really in a mood right now. Mm-hmm. You've seen them draw a line in the sand on missile defense. You've seen the announcements from Moscow of wanting to pull out of the non-Lugar programs that help reduce nuclear stockpiles and secure fissile material in Russia. So it's very volatile right now. We have a Russia that's not in the mood to play ball. So you'll have an Obama administration that will try. It will try to keep Russia reset policy, if you will, alive, try to move forward on arms control issues. I think a candidate, Romney, if Romney becomes president, will be less interested in pursuing arms control agreements with Russia, will be more cautious about seeing how Russia is acting in its neighborhood. So regardless of the way forward, it's going to be bumpy. We're going to have some bumps along the way as the Russians push our limits on missile defense, and as they push, frankly, our limits on what's acceptable policy to treat their neighbors. And this is where I think we have to be working closely with Europe to say, okay, some of this behavior is unacceptable and we're going to call you on it.
Well, speaking of Russian reset, what's your take on it? Well, it feels here that, well, the reset is essentially over. Because 2 years ago, for example, I was in an auditorium where I saw the ambassador of the United States and ambassador of Russia, well, meet and talk together and sidelining all the differences and problems that both countries have. But now it seems that all the rhetoric is just gone.
So look, the symbolism and rhetoric of Russia reset is we've moved beyond it. You're right. It almost sounds foolish to continue to talk about Russia reset. Russia reset was intended by the Obama administration to help bridge a gap at as they came to power. After the Russian invasion of Georgia, relationship between Russia and the United States was at rock bottom. The important thing is, I don't think it was at rock bottom because of U.S. policy. It was at rock bottom because Russia invaded Georgia, because of Russian policies. And so the reset policy was an attempt to bridge that gap so that we could move on and try to work together. The Obama administration accomplished that. They bridged the gap, went to work on an agenda. Right now it sounds a little bit foolish to talk about positive rhetoric and symbolism. But what I think still remains valid is an effort to figure out how to work with Russia where we have common interests at stake. That means, how do we work with them in the UN Security Council on an issue like Syria, on Iran sanctions? How do we continue counterterrorism cooperation with Russia? How do we actually continue to move forward on arms control, nuclear strategic reductions? How do we get more transparency into Russian tactical nuclear weapons, which are a primary concern here in a country like Latvia because they're on your borders? So there's an interest-based reason to move forward with Russia on some of these issues. And the challenge for any American leader is how do you move forward on these areas where we have common interests or we have interest to pursue an agenda without sacrificing our values and our principles. And that's really the rub. That's the test that the next president's going to face.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how important is Russia for the United States? Well, if you look at Afghanistan and Iran, then it feels that Russia is just a tool for the United States to pursue its interests in the Middle East. Is this what's your opinion on this?
So this is part of the disconnect. For Russia, the United States is its number one focus. Mm-hmm. For the United States, Russia is not. And in some respects, that's not assuring if you're sitting in Moscow. You want to be the focus of U.S. attention. But why has Russia mattered to the Obama administration? Because we have to supply our forces in Afghanistan. Because we have to keep international sanctions on Iran to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. Because we need to find a way forward to deal with a catastrophe in Syria. In each of these areas, Russia can be a spoiler. So the importance of the United States to Russia is how to mitigate the damage that Russia can cause on the international stage. It's not the object of U.S. policy in that respect. It's a critical partner to get to resolution of some of these issues. But you're right, there is a bit of a dichotomy. Americans don't sit in Washington and constantly obsess about how to move forward on Russia itself. We're more focused on how Russia can disrupt an agenda that we want to get accomplished working with Europe.
Well, thank you for this interesting discussion. And well, this was Damon Wilson from the Atlantic Council. Thank you.